How's it going, Andrew? You're through in Edinburgh, right?
Great. It's unusually good here as well, and unusually warm.
Good. It's all we can talk about because it's sunny, right?
Yeah.
But also, we'll talk about the tech stuff. So, yeah, we've got an awesome speaker coming up. So we will meet her in a second. But just to let you know, you can use the Q&A and YouTube, and you can ask questions. And at the end of her talk, we will we'll ask those. And you can tweet us at Scottish Devs, and you can use hashtag Scottish Developers with your question, or just any comments or feedback or any of that stuff. But tonight our speaker is Angela. Hi, Angela.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. You're joining us from Copenhagen, right?
Yes, that's right. Where we also have good weather, so it seems we're aligned.
Yeah, that's good. You're also inside at a computer instead of outside enjoying the sun. So I'm glad you're with us on that one. Cool. So would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. I also prepared something in my slide with introduction, but just shortly, Angela Timofte. I'm originally from Romania, but moved to Denmark, where I am currently living. And I work as a data platform manager at Trustpilot.
Awesome. Great. So we'll let you share your screen now, and you're going to chat to us about DynamoDB and kind of data access patterns in the real world. So over to you.
All right, cool. Can you see my screen?
We can, yeah. And I'll leave you to it, and I'll come back for the Q&A later.
Yes, great. All right. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining and for staying in on a sunny day. Hopefully it will be worth it. But yeah, today I'll talk about Amazon DynamoDB, and we'll look at some advanced data access patterns in the real world. But yeah, just before I jump into the presentation of today, as I mentioned earlier, I'm originally from Romania, as some of you might guess from my name, but I moved 9 years ago in Denmark. And out of those 9 years, for the past 6 years, I've worked at Trustpilot as a data platform manager, and all I can say about that is that time flies when you're having fun, and being part of the data team, it's definitely fun for me. But besides my day-to-day work, I really enjoy sharing my knowledge, and I participate in various conferences and meetups as this one, and for that I've been recognized as an AWS serverless hero. And I'm also the coordinator of the AWS community in Copenhagen. So if you're interested in talking in Copenhagen, please feel free to reach out. And on that note, if you want to connect and talk more about databases, serverless architecture, or anything for that matter, please follow me on Twitter or connect on LinkedIn. Or if you want to see what I'm doing in my free time, you can also follow me on Instagram. But with that being said, let's look at the agenda that I prepared for you today. So I'll go with the assumption that hopefully everyone knows who Trustpilot is. If not, you will know after this, hopefully. But I'll start with a very short introduction about Trustpilot so that we can spend more time on our journey working with Amazon DynamoDB. Looking at some misconceptions that we had, some lessons that we've learned, and things that I want to share with you from our experience. And then jumping into the main topic of today's presentation, which is modeling real-life data using DynamoDB. And the part here where I mentioned real-life data is really important for me, because when you try to learn something new, and all the tutorials or documentation that you can find, it's basically the hello world type of examples. But then when you try to apply that to your use case, things get way more complicated and you can't find any documentation anymore and you're kind of lost. So that's why I wanted this presentation to focus on a real life example, data that I've worked with and things that I've learned from it. And we'll finish up with talking about some benefits and downsides of working with DynamoDB. And in the end, we'll have some time for questions and hopefully I'll have some answers for you. But let's get started. So Trustpilot. Trustpilot is an online review platform whose mission is to become a symbol of trust. We want our platform to be a space for consumers to find trusted companies and also a space where they can share their experiences. But at the same time, we also want to help companies to improve their offerings and also connect with their customers. Trustpilot was founded in 2007. And since then, the company has grown substantially, and we've added 8 global offices. We have an office in Copenhagen, where I am based, and in London, in Edinburgh, which is actually our newest office that we've opened last year. An office in Vilnius, Lithuania, Berlin, New York, Denver, and also all the way to Melbourne, Australia. We have over 700 employees all over the world. And I have to mention one of our really big achievements this year was that Trustpilot went public on the London Stock Exchange. And maybe you've seen this in the news, or maybe not, but it has been a really tremendous achievement for the company, and was great for me being part of the company for so many years to see this happening. But looking at the Trustpilot growth and to just show you how our data really and how the company grew over time, I just put here a chart where I'm just showing the number of active reviews over time. And you can see in 2007, we didn't really have much data, but since then that number just went up. And from a business perspective, this is amazing. It's amazing to see how everything it's doubling up and the company is growing. But of course, this type of growth, when it came to technology, it introduced a lot of challenges and issues, and some of the decisions that we've taken, we had to go back and rethink and come with a different solution to really make our product scalable for the business that we were having. And talking about challenges and our history, I want to jump in the topic of our journey with Amazon DynamoDB. And I can't talk about Amazon DynamoDB without really looking at the database transitions that we had at Trustpilot, because really that will show some of the challenges that we had in working with DynamoDB, but even before that, some of the foundations that caused some of the misconceptions that we had later on. So if we look at the transitions, when we started Trustpilot in 2007, as we've seen, we didn't really had any data, and it was decided to just go for a MySQL database on premise. It was what people had experience with, and probably databases was the last concern that they were having when they were just starting the business. But of course, as the company started to grow, this decision was starting to cause issues, and we're having problems keeping our product live, to be honest. So for that reason, around 2011, it was decided to move all of our data from our MySQL database to MongoDB. And Around that time, MongoDB was growing in popularity and was also the perfect type of database for our use cases, for the types of use cases that we're having. So that's why it was decided that we'll store all of our data in MongoDB. But of course, even before finishing this transition from MySQL to MongoDB, we've started to see problems with our MongoDB clusters. And we're having, again, scalability issues, but also we could see that our use cases change over time, and storing everything in MongoDB wasn't really a good solution anymore. So that's why around 2017, we started to look for other options. And that's when we started to look at DynamoDB. But something to mention here, and you can see on the slide that I put 3 dots in there under DynamoDB. And that's actually a very important part, because what we've learned from our previous experience was that putting all of your data into one type of database, it's actually not the right way to go. And especially nowadays, when you have so many options of databases, you really need to look at the database that was built for your use case and store data accordingly. So now at TrustPilot, we're really looking at what we're trying to solve, what's the use case, and then go for the database that was created to solve that. But still, DynamoDB, it's our top choice when it comes to operational databases, and that's why I want us to look more into how we went from the beginning to DynamoDB and how we use it nowadays as well. I would like to say that going to DynamoDB was smooth and easy, but unfortunately that wasn't the case. And there were various reasons why transitioning to DynamoDB wasn't that easy, but I would say the main one was the fact that we're having a lot of experience with MongoDB. We're used with the way that we would store the data in MongoDB, with how we would query the data in MongoDB, and also the options that you had in terms of what the database itself could do for you. And moving from that to a new type of database, which at the time there weren't that many tutorials or videos or companies that were sharing their experience, it did cause issues for us. And parts of those issues was the configuration part, which DynamoDB, it's enabling engineers. At the end of the day, that's like one amazing benefit of DynamoDB. But that meant engineers had to deal with things that we're not really dealing with. And the first one was provisioning. So to take advantage of DynamoDB, you really need to provision for your use case. And one mistake that I've seen it at TrustPilot, but outside as well, is provisioning too much. And in this case, you'll just end up paying for more than you need. So it's not a really good use of a serverless database as DynamoDB. And in here, actually, the example that I'm sharing and the screenshot that I took was actually us changing the auto-scaling policy of DynamoDB, and we're running some kind of scripts, and we wanted the auto-scaling to be changed, but then of course we forgot to update it back to the normal auto-scaling policy, so we ended up paying more than we had to. But then the opposite of provisioning too much is, of course, provisioning too little. And I would say this is an even more dangerous use case with DynamoDB, because if you provision too little and you constantly have spikes that are going above the provisioning capacity, then you have throttling problems. And what that means, if this goes for long periods of time, then you can even lose data if you don't have mechanisms of retrying. So really pay attention to your provisioning. And as I said, this was something that was causing us some problems as engineers going to DynamoDB and use this type of database. But all of these can be solved, and that's what we actually did at Trustpilot by just using on-demand. And this is something that AWS introduced later on, so we didn't have this from the beginning, but I would say it's an amazing feature that it really made our lives much more easily, because now with on-demand, AWS will scale up and down your database based on your usage. But something to keep in mind when it comes to on-demand is that in case you have uncontrolled workloads, then of course it can create some cost issues for you. So really keep in mind what type of queries, services you have, and make sure that they are controlled, because one thing with DynamoDB, it can scale. It will scale for you, but sometimes you probably don't want to scale it that much or to that level in case it's something that you are not expected or really wanted to scale for. So it's something to keep in mind with the on-demand. But from our experience now, by default, we always create DynamoDB tables with on-demand provisioning, because we've noticed we actually saved money with this, and that was like another misconception that we had, that it will be much more expensive with on-demand. But in reality, we ended up saving money, because apparently we weren't that great at provisioning ourselves, and also some of these mistakes of forgetting to put back the auto scaling and so on. So it's definitely something that you want to consider when working with DynamoDB. But then another misconception that we had in the beginning when working with DynamoDB and when we're trying to switch to this type of database was that we're thinking that it's just a key value store. And this actually caused a lot of problems for us. First of all, in the beginning, we were thinking that we can only store like simple type of queries where we just put like an ID as a key and then we get the value, and that's kind of it. And those were the use cases that we're using DynamoDB for, and that wasn't great, because us looking at DynamoDB was really to put some of our high load services, and those also included some more complex queries, and we couldn't really see how to do that. And a really big mistake, and one of the biggest I've seen, is really not defining the access patterns when it comes to DynamoDB. And what happens when you don't start with your queries and you don't store your the data in the way that you access, it will really create more problems that will solve for you. And in this example here, I just took a screenshot of a table that we had at some point, where you can see we're storing like an item that it's contains a list of 161 items, and then the way that we're querying this table was to take the item, then go through the whole list in there, look for something that we needed. If we found it, make an update, then store it back to the database. And like the access patterns were all over the place. And what that caused was this table to be one of our most expensive tables that we had. I think was almost the same price as all the other tables that we're having in DynamoDB. So really that just shows if you don't define your access patterns, and we weren't doing that in the beginning really, because we're just used to kind of dump data and then think about how we'll use it, it will create problems. And for that reason, actually, I want the next section to really focus on this modeling your data with DynamoDB, because I think that's like the most important part that you should spend time learning when it comes to DynamoDB. So The example that I prepared for you today, as I mentioned already a couple of times, it is a real-life example, but I have one disclaimer though. This is a simplified example, so if you go to trustpilot.com and you go to our categories page, you will see something looking like this. But just to presentation in time that I have, and for me to explain in an easier way what we're doing here, I simplified it, but still make sure that I kept all the gotchas and tricks that I learned working on this data specifically. But now let's see what we're trying to do. So we have this category page, and what we need to do is to get the list of businesses for a specific category. In this case, we have the clothes category. And then we need to filter the businesses based on the country and the company status. And here it can be claimed and unclaimed. And then I want this list to be ordered by the number of reviews in descending order. So that's the first thing that I need to do. And then the second part is to get the list of categories that a company is a part of. So now let's see how we model this data in DynamoDB. First of all, let's look at the data that we have. So what we want to store, it's a business ID, a ranked category IDs, which it's a list. We have the identifying name, which is the name of the company, the review count, the status, and the country ID. And if we try to put the information that I presented on the page into a query, what we are actually trying to do, if we think this in SQL, because I find most of the people are going towards SQL when they think about querying a database, and that's why I went for that. So what we need to do is select the businesses from our table where the category is clothes, the country is NL, Netherlands, and the status is claimed, and we want the list to be ordered by the review count in descending order. So how can we do this with DynamoDB? Well, the table that I created to answer that query is this one. But now let's see in more details, like what exactly have I done here. So first of all, for my partition key, I chose to use the categories, category IDs. And then in my sort key, I started with the country ID, followed by the status of the company, the number of reviews, and then the identifying name. And one thing to keep in mind when it comes to DynamoDB is that the primary key has to be unique. And in our case, we have the primary key is composed of the partition key and the sort key. So the combination of these two needs to be unique. And for that reason, in my case, I actually chose to store the identifying name in my sort key so that I make this combination unique. And this is something to keep in mind so that you don't overwrite your data if the primary key is not unique. And the last part in my table that I've added is the business unit ID, which is an attribute. But now going back to the query that I was trying to answer, and for the first query, I actually don't need the business unit ID, so I'll just leave that aside for now. But how do we answer that query with this table in DynamoDB? And the way that we'll do it is, for our partition key, we'll put the category we want, which is clothes. And then for our sort key, we will choose begins with. And when it comes to the sort key, you actually have multiple options to choose from. So you can choose equal, of course, between, higher, lower, and so on. But in our case here, we want to use begins with. And then the value is NL and claimed. And we wanted the list to be order descending. So the results that we'll get are these ones, where our partition key is closed. That's what we're looking for. And then our sort key begins with NL and claimed. But one thing that you will notice here is that the order is actually not correct. We've actually got company 2, which has 250 reviews, before company 1, which has a higher number of reviews. And actually, we've done this mistake with our data when we're sorting our data, and we've noticed the order of businesses was not correct. And we're like, okay, what's happening? Is Dynamo the right choice, and so on? We had all those questions, but of course this happened because our sort key is a string, and then we are comparing numbers in there. But of course, being a string, the first digit of the number will be compared, and in our case will be the 2 from 250 and 1 from 1,500. So to fix this, what we've done was to add zeros in front of those numbers, so the correct digit is being compared. But this is something to keep in mind. If you will add numbers in your sort key and you want to actually sort that data, then having numbers can cause some of these issues. For us, was a very simple fix. We just looked at the highest number for review count, and then we knew how many zeros to add. And this data is being refreshed every day, so it was very easy to make the change. And with this change, of course, the right order is being returned, and we basically answer to the query that we have defined. But then going back to the other query that we wanted to make was to select the categories from our table where the business ID is, for example, 1, 2, 3. And if we want to do that using the table structure that we've defined in the beginning, with DynamoDB, we will have to define a global secondary index. And when it comes to secondary indexes, we can choose a partition key, and in our case, we chose business ID. We can also add a sort key, so similar to the primary key and the primary table that we created, but in our case, we don't need to sort the list, so we'll skip that. But something very important when it comes to secondary indexes is the projected attributes. And DynamoDB offers 3 options. And by default, it's set to all, so it will project all the attributes in your table. Then you have includes, where you can specify, besides the keys, what other attributes to include in your projected table. And then the smallest projection that you can make is keys only. And that one, of course, it will just include the keys of the table. And it's very important to keep this in mind. And I've seen this as a mistake from people where they just leave this to projecting everything. And the problem with that, of course, in our case here, it's a small table. You don't see that problem. But imagine you have a lot of attributes in your table, and then if for each secondary index you project everything, of course you have larger indexes than you have, so you'll pay more and there will be more processing on your table. So you want to avoid that, and that's why you should only project the attributes that you actually need for your queries. So if we create this global secondary index, our PK now it's business ID, and to answer the query that we have, we'll switch to use the secondary index, and the partition key will be business ID in this case, and we'll say 1, 2, 3. And then the right result is going to be outputted where we can see the right business ID was received, and the rest of the information is correct. No gotcha there. So the right information was returned. But now looking at the table and the structure that we have and the page that we used, one thing to keep in mind is that, as I mentioned, this is a simplified version. So something that will appear once you start adding maybe more filters or more data, more types of queries. If you see in my table here, actually for the primary key, which is the partition key and the sort key, I kept those names generic. And that's a trick to keep in mind when storing data in DynamoDB. If you keep that generic, that means you can store other data as well. If I was to say for the partition key, that's going to hold only category ID, and for the sort key, it's going to only have country, status, number of reviews, and name. What I've seen people doing when they store it that way, they'll go, if they have another type of query of like filters and so on, they'll store that as an attribute, and then they'll create another secondary index where they will make basically the same thing that I've made here with the PK and SK. But you can achieve that by just storing that information in the primary key, but it will be, of course, different data. Of course, that might make it a bit more difficult to work with the table, and that's something that I've seen happening where we went a bit too much in this reusing the primary key, that it made it a bit more difficult to know what's happening. So you definitely need really good documentation in that case to know what exactly you're doing with your table. And in some cases, you might want to take the decision of actually creating a secondary index or even creating a separate table. But still keep in mind this trick where you have the partition key and the sort key generic, and you can store different types of information. And then, yeah, if you add more queries that you need in here, you can easily store them in this structure so that you don't end up with 30 tables just for one page, for instance. But now let's talk about some of the benefits and downsides of working with DynamoDB. And I would say the most important benefit of DynamoDB is that it's highly scalable, and really that was the main driver for us investing and learning how to work with DynamoDB and sticking with it in the beginning when it wasn't as easy as we might have wanted. And also, that's the main reason why DynamoDB, it is our top choice when it comes to operational databases. The other benefit is that it is fully managed. And as an engineer myself, I can say that I really enjoyed this part where I can easily use DynamoDB and everything, like even options like on demand. It's done by AWS. I don't have to think about the provision anymore. I had to before, but anymore I don't have to. And anything like database patches and all the database configuration that is taken care of, and I can just focus on building products. It is fast and consistent, which you want from any database. It is cheap. And I know this one might be raising some eyebrows. And if you actually search for downsides of DynamoDB, people will say that it's expensive. And it can be expensive if you don't use it correctly. And as I showed you previously in the example where we were just storing data randomly and then our queries were all over the place, we were scanning tables as well, which is like going through the whole database. Of course, it can become expensive, but if you use it the right way, DynamoDB, it is cheap compared to other offerings. So yeah, I really stick to this benefit. It has built-in security, and then it also is perfectly integrated with other AWS services, which again goes back to the enabling engineers to work very easily with DynamoDB, integrated with services like AWS Lambda, and it has streams and so on. So it's a very well integrated with other services, which makes it a great choice in many use cases. But now talking about some of the downsides of working with DynamoDB, I would say that it does take time to learn how to set the data correctly. And I've seen this, of course, in the beginning when we're starting working with DynamoDB and we didn't have the experience and there wasn't a lot of documentation. But I still see that with new engineers who haven't had a lot of experience with DynamoDB, even if they have some, but they really just store, as we're doing in the beginning, this like more key value store type of data and not looking into the more advanced patterns. It does take them some time. Even I've had situations where I was doing the whole data structure myself, and then I gave that to other teams with less experience. Then it was quite difficult for them to understand what was happening in there with some of these more composite keys. So it's something to take into consideration, that it will take time for people to understand how to set data correctly in DynamoDB. But I would say once you really see this type of combination, then it becomes much easier for sure. And another downside of DynamoDB and really going into the more advanced patterns is really it can become convoluted rapidly depending on your queries. And as I was mentioning earlier, if you start adding more type of queries, more data in your partition key and sort key, it can become convoluted quite rapidly. So it's something again to consider when working with DynamoDB. And with that being said, I just want to say a huge thank you for sticking to this presentation on a sunny day. But I just want to mention before jumping to questions that we are hiring at Trustpilot. We are looking for a lot of engineers, for engineer managers, product managers, and we are hiring in multiple locations, Copenhagen, Vilnius, and also our newest office, Edinburgh. And with that, I want to say thank you. And yeah, now we can jump to questions, I guess.
So, hey, so I had a question for you, Angela, actually.
Let me switch.
Sorry, yeah, so is there any type of scenario you think DynamoDB, this is somewhat negative, definitely shouldn't be used for?
Well, I would say you should not use DynamoDB if you have unpredictable queries, because that's like the most important part when it comes to DynamoDB. You need to start with your queries, and that's what I was trying to highlight also in my presentation. Like, start with your queries and save the data in a way that it will answer that query. But if you don't know how you're gonna query, then don't go for DynamoDB for sure, because yeah, you'll suffer.
It's a good rule for life, though, isn't it? Though, like, what do you want to do with the data? Then model the data rather than jumping into modeling the data. It's yeah, a good rule to live by. I had a question, which is always my go-to one whenever I learn about kind of new tech. But where's the go-to place to learn? If someone wants to get started knowing nothing about DynamoDB, where would you recommend?
Yeah, I mean, nowadays, as I said, there is a lot of documentation, and there's a really good community when it comes to AWS. I would say if you want to really go in all the details, Cloud Guru offers a lot of documentation, but I would say that's a bit more advanced. If you want to start learning, I would say just create a table, put some data, and think of how you would model that, and yeah, use the AWS documentation. And there are so many, yeah, as I said, so many people that you can follow. Jeremy Dale is someone that I recommend for people to follow. He has a lot of demos and presentations, not just about DynamoDB, but like AWS in general. So yeah, that's someone that you can look up to.
So we have a question from Lee, who's saying, why should we use DynamoDB instead of Aurora DB?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I've actually had the presentation, I think a month ago or something like that, where I was presenting like both options. And with Aurora database now, so you have the classic one, which I would say it's very different. The use cases that you have, that's like more, okay, do you need a SQL or a NoSQL database? But then you have the serverless Aurora, which comes really in the battle there with DynamoDB being also serverless. But with Aurora DB serverless, we have version 1, and now they've released in November or December, I think. They released version 2, which is promising to solve some of the problems that we've seen with version 1 not being really stable and not making it so easy to work with. So I expect more people going to Aurora serverless version 2. It's still a matter of price. DynamoDB, it's still much cheaper than Aurora. I would say that. And then it's in terms of the use cases that you have, and DynamoDB, it's as I said, like highly integrated with all the other services. You have streams. You can really make your whole application serverless. And yeah, there are various advantages. It's highly scalable, and that's something that, yeah, as I mentioned at Trustball, we've been suffering for going for options that weren't so scalable as we wanted to be. So I hope that answered the question. I rambled a lot.
No, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it was fairly comprehensive. So do you think the kind of almost no ops or serverless savings are definitely offset any kind of learning curve in terms of obviously the mental model you were talking about that people have to go through if they're just used to a SQL database, in terms of the kind of modeling you were showing about the composite keys and the ways you could store data based on how you were going to efficiently look it up?
Yes, so to make sure I understood your question, I think my internet also dropped for a second there. So if going from a SQL mindset to the DynamoDB, if that helped, or if it's actually the opposite, is that the question that you had?
So basically, is the saving of not having to manage the database or deal with the environment as much because it's serverless, do you definitely see that as much kind of worth the learning curve of DynamoDB being very different from what you're used to?
Okay, yeah, I see. I would say it's not just the serverless part, right, and the knobs. As an engineer, I definitely enjoy that because I can just put something myself right away. I don't have to go through like the hurdle of like asking for a database to be created. Then that will have to be prioritized by the database admin and so on. So I enjoy that part, but it's not just that when it comes to DynamoDB. It's also, yeah, as I said, the scalability that it offers, and having something on premise, for instance, or like an Aurora classic database, then you have to deal with all these problems that will always occur at the worst moment, like during the night, where you're like, oh, I need to scale my database, and you're like, why didn't I go for a managed database that can just do that for myself completely? So these are some of the use cases. I would say, like, yeah, it's worth it to go through that learning curve.
I can see we've got, oh, you're just putting the question up there. Thanks, Andrew. So we've got a question from Ewan. It says, before you switched to AWS, were there other cloud database services considered? And if so, which and why choose AWS over them?
Yes. I need to think, going back in time in history. I think there were others. I can't remember which ones we've looked into. I would say we went for AWS because some of our services were already in AWS. One thing to mention, though, since then we've actually started to use GCP as well as a cloud provider, and now we have some of our data in GCP, like our data warehouse. It's all in BigQuery, and we're starting to use some of the the services from GCP, and we're really going for like which one has the best option, and choose that. But at the time when we went for DynamoDB, I think it was mainly because we were already having our services in AWS, and that was just making it much easier for us, and was also directly correlated with Lambda being released by AWS.
Cool. So I think that was all the questions that we had from the audience. Thank you so much for sharing all of that valuable and real world insight, which is always a big difference from your usual kind of talks or kind of demos of stuff that one could Google. Oh, in fact, we have John McManus with another question. What is the development backend that connects to DynamoDB, and do you use a framework like Spring DBA for integration?
So in terms of backend for DynamoDB, we use all the services from AWS. So it's connected directly to Lambda. We try to go for serverless architecture as much as possible. So that's one thing. And when it comes to porting that data, for instance, from DynamoDB to our data warehouse, we use Kafka. So that's another service that we use in the backend for data transitions. But we don't use Spring database.
Cool. Well, John was pretty snappy in there before I cut you off.
We'll give it a few minutes in case there's any more questions, I guess. But no, that's really awesome. Thank you for giving us your evening, and for sticking around for questions as well. Really, really appreciate it. And you're going to visit us when you visit the Edinburgh office, aren't you?
Absolutely. Yeah, it was my pleasure to come and chat here. Thanks for sticking around, and for sure I'll come and visit when I also come and visit all my colleagues from Edinburgh.
Yeah, can't wait.
Ideally at festival time.
Ideally, that's what I heard. I need to come in that period for sure.
The New Year's party is also pretty good.
Yeah.
There you go. More options.
Okay.
Awesome. Thanks very much for joining us. See you soon.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And Andrew, would you like before we log off to let folks know about
Sure.
the next meetup?
So just a couple of things from me before I let everyone enjoy the nice weather. So at our next meetup on Wednesday, the 11th of August, we have Michael Steib, and he will be talking about getting started with GraphQL in .NET. And Michael's a Microsoft MVP, and he's also actually an author on Hot Chocolate, the GraphQL library for .NET. So who better to hear from on that topic? And as usual, if you need to get or want to get in touch with us, you can reach out on @ScottishDevs on Twitter or via the meetup group. Anyway, just before I let everyone go, anything from you, Carol?
No, I think that's it. We've also got the Facebook and the LinkedIn groups that I don't feel like we give the same love as we give Twitter, but you can also get us on there. And yeah, sign up to meetup. We'll be like hitting announce on that next meetup probably tonight, so you'll get a notification about it. And you can sign up and we'll see you there.
Awesome. Well, bye everyone.
Thanks everyone. See you soon.
In mobile.